Okay, thank you. Good evening, everyone. All right, in the midst of our winter, and now we're past Groundhog Day, so I'm told that because of the precession of the Earth, that the length of light is accelerating now. Every day is greater than the day before, and things are going in the right direction. So we're continuing with the Tibetan tradition of mental development, and we've come to the point of the fully endowed human body, or often translated as the precious human body. And maybe to say a couple of things, um, really sort of in context or preparation for that, because something that I've noticed um, from my own experience is that people in the West, come to the Dharma with like a sincere seeking, and excuse me, so different than culturally for us than it is for what I perceive of the Tibetans. Where the Tibetans start out with this, you don't have to convince them of much about Dharma. I mean, anybody to come to realization, to practice, to benefit, you're looking deeply into your mind, and we all kind of face the same challenges, no difference. But for the starting point, you know, um, the Tibetans will be in a situation, and you can see this with Kempo, that you're just teaching the method. They sort of understood in the audiences that they're speaking to. Basically, people are convinced of the rightness of the Dharma. Maybe they're not motivated to act so much on it for one reason or another, but the teachings are all method. Uh, the nitty gritty, the nuts and bolts of how to accomplish. But for us in the West, we often need a little bit more explanation of that. We have other areas of doubt, and we have different kind of traditions that we have absorbed even without knowing it. Um, so I want to say a couple of things uh, related to that. So this is from the beginning of Edward Kanzi's book, 1964, Buddhist Thought in India. Um, One thing I've noticed, for instance, with the Tibetans is the deep respect that they have for India and where the teachings came from. I mean, it's really quite remarkable because that's something that seems to me very American is that, we left Europe behind. We all came here, moved here over the ocean, all of that. And we just rejected the past. Somehow what's on their dollar bill, that Novo Ordo Secularum or something, a new order of the world, because we were kind of a revolutionary governmental idea, throwing out the king. And so we have this way of kind of discarding the past as somehow being, an impediment somehow. We're always talking about how wonderful progress is, everything's going forward, um, like that. And yet the Tibetans, this incredible respect for the Indians, even though Buddhism really died out in India. Uh, so that's a wonderful thing because it puts you in kind of a context, and it puts you in a smaller, a more humble way. But it's actually out of that humility that the greatness comes. Um, that story of um, a samurai visiting a Zen master, and this ritual kind of tea ceremony, not really the tea ceremony, but just the ritual sharing of tea. So the master's there, the samurai's facing him, seated on the floor, and the attendant brings in a teapot and two teacups. And so he pours the master's tea, and then the master puts his tea down, takes the teapot, and he's going to pour it for the samurai. Special kind of honor. And he's pouring the tea and pouring the tea higher, higher, and then it's full. He keeps pouring the tea. It's overflowing. It's overflowing. And of course, they're under this strict kind of etiquette. And the samurai is always kind of self-contained and unflappable. But at last, he can't stand it. He says, "Stop, stop! No more will go in." And he said, "Like your mind, full of opinions attitudes. You have to empty your mind. So it's a wonderful thing, to have that kind of honest respect and gratitude for the past. Aristotle said somewhere that gratitude is the shortest lived human emotion. And that's very us, our New York, like, what'd you do for me yesterday? So Kanzi does, of course, a wonderful job. He's not talking about Tibetan Buddhism. He really didn't know anything about Tibetan Buddhism. He was always working from Sanskrit text, if you can imagine. He did consult with Tibetan lamas, especially Dejung Rinpoche, this great Sakya master, now passed away. But what he gleaned from the study of those texts and his own practice too, he talks about doing a weekend retreat in Surrey at one point, and some things he said about kind of, having an experience of like the raw experience of your ego, how kind of humbling and frightening thing that is when you see it nakedly. But nonetheless, he says, until quite recently, all human societies took the separation of the sacred and the profane for granted. Certain places were set apart as holy places. As in the distribution of space, so in the universe of discourse. Some words were numinous, others rational or ordinary. If treated as though purely rational, numinous terms suffer a great deal of distortion. An easy example is the word God. Natural theology, or the deists, used it as a rational term. But as Blaise Pascal put it, this God of the philosophers is something quite different from, quote, the God of Abraham and Isaac, unquote. An Oxford Don showed his blindness for this distinction when he criticized Jehovah for describing himself by the tautological phrase, I am that I am, when in fact he ought to have told us exactly what he was. Meister Eckhart's beautiful meditation on this phrase from the book of Exodus shows that ho on is clearly a numinous term of great profundity. No student of Buddhist scriptures in the original can fail to notice that they abound in numinous words such as Dharma, Buddha, Bhagavat, Arhat, Nirvana, Tathagata, and their prominence has many important consequences. He has a footnote. It says one of these consequences is that parts of the doctrine were held to be so sacred that they had to be protected from desecration by the profane. The line between exoteric and esoteric shifted in the course of time, and thereby much uncertainty is thrown on the chronology of the doctrinal developments. We know roughly when certain doctrines were first made public, but among the initiated, they may have existed a long time beforehand. All right. So esoteric is like the secret knowledge, and exoteric is the outer knowledge. Yeah. It accounts to some extent for the ambiguity and multivalence of nearly all the key terms of Buddhist philosophy. This disregard for the first requisite of an ideal language, which would be that there should be only one name for every simple and never the same name for two different simples, is unlikely to be due to mere carelessness and thoughtlessness. Nor can it be blamed on the poverty of the available Sanskrit vocabulary. In fact, Sanskrit offers a wider range of philosophical synonyms than any other language except Greek. Probably the numinous character of the terms used is responsible. On closer analysis, words such as manashikara, attention, upeksha, even-mindedness, dhatu, element, or akasha, space, turned out to contain a great variety of meanings. If the later Buddhists did not distinguish these meanings by separate terms, the reason was that the traditional, though multivalent terms, were hallowed by the fact of their having been uttered by the Lord Buddha himself. It would therefore have been an act of impiety or sacrilege to replace them with profane, though perhaps more accurate terms. There are other reasons also for the multivalence of Buddhist technical terms. Those which concern the particularly sacred core of the doctrine disclose their meaning in a state of religious exaltation. To give them a precise logical definition would seem a task too trivial to bother about. Furthermore, semantic distinctions become important to the extent that communication has broken down. Among lovers, communication is very easy. They understand each other perfectly well, and each one intuitively knows what the other's words mean. In the absence of such a bond of sympathy, every word must be defined, and nevertheless, misunderstandings continue to arise faster than they can be removed. Buddhist thinking was designed for a sangha, or community of like-minded people who, at least in theory, were more brethren than rivals, and who had the same training, never ceased to agree on fundamentals, and who understood one another's mental processes. When they heard these terms, they simply knew what was meant, just as an educated Englishman can read a piece of sophisticated prose without looking up the words in a dictionary, though also without being able to convey their full meaning to half-educated persons. In actual fact, the meaning of words is defined by their usage among an elite of insiders, who among themselves rarely experience much difficulty. It is when the message has to be conveyed to outsiders that the precise definitions, semantic distinctions, and so on become necessary. A soteriological doctrine like Buddhism becomes a philosophy when its intellectual content is explained to outsiders. This is not a particularly rewarding task, but in this book I have undertaken it. It must never be forgotten that it involves a huge loss of substance. There are four possible sources of knowledge, that is, sense perception, reasoning, intuition, and revelation. So again, sense perception, reasoning, intuition, and revelation. Buddhists regard sense perception as basically misleading. If reasoning is taken to mean inference from sense data, it is condemned altogether with its basis. Alternatively, as in European rationalism, it may mean the apprehension of an intelligible as a distinct from the sensible world. The European rationalists believed that at least four different kinds of things cannot be deduced from sense data. That is, the laws of logic, the laws of mathematics, moral principles as distinct from moral rules, and natural law as distinct from the actual laws of any given society. In the Buddhist scheme of things, the study of the dharmas is a rational approach to intelligible entities. Cognition, jnana, is established by paying attention to dharmas. Those Buddhists who specialize in the Abhidharma constitute the rationalist wing of this religion. Okay. So, intuition and revelation. Reasoning, yeah, and revelation. All right. Now he says also, if the value of life depends on contact with a high level of reality, it becomes, of course, important to ascertain what reality is in its own being. And this term, own being, in Sanskrit is svabhava. So we start out with our mantra, Om Svabhava, Om, the own being of things. And to be able to distinguish that from lesser realities of comparative fiction, which constitute our normal world of half socialized experience, which we have made ourselves so as to suit our own ends. To establish contact with worthwhile reality has always been the concern of the exponents of the perennial philosophy, i.e., of most reputable philosophers of both Europe and Asia, up until about the year 1450.
Frank,
Yeah,
can you explain the meaning of Om? Is it Om Shravada?
yeah, um, many meanings. But the reason the mantras start with Om, almost all mantras, Om is the Dharmakaya. So it has the complete spaciousness, the complete unlimitlessness of the mind, and actually of even appearances when we understand the nature of them. So Om is immediately, you might say, there. You're immediately. It's like when it says to immediately drop all attachments to ordinary appearances. That's Om. And yet it's completely inclusive too. Nothing is excluded. So it's instead of our ordinary habitual mind with which we're doing everything, the mantras start out with kind of like a slap in the face. Immediately we're transcendent, you might say.
Right. So,
And this permeates throughout the teachings. I mean, for instance, when you read the sutras that almost all the Mahayana sutras, at least the ones that I know, but certainly where the Buddha is teaching on Vulture Peak, where he gave one of the Amitabha Sutras and the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. I mean, when they're discussing who's present, it's just like thousands of monks and nuns and all sorts of devas floating around, and there's this tremendous explosion of wisdom beings. And yet, when you actually go to that physical spot, it's just this little tiny hilltop. So right away, it's kind of like smashing our attachment to our rational mind, our limited mind. Mm.
so Om Shravada Shudo Ham.
Yeah, Om Svabhava Shuddha Sarvadharma Svabhava Shuddha Hang. And that's where every visualization starts with that, dropping attachment to ordinary appearances. So that's the great emptiness. And then it's out of that arises what? The seed syllable of the particular Buddha that we're meditating on. That's why Garba Rinpoche, I think he's just so incredibly skillful and knows where students are at in that. Most of us confronted by the visualization of a mandala, it's just such a lot of learning just to learn the different parts, let alone whatever. And then the detail of it is, is just like incredible. And yet he knows that letter hung is the entire thing. It's all there. So he allows people just to meditate on the hung, either at their navel spot, just below the navel, or at the heart, easier to focus on. And even there, the different parts of the hung takes a while for someone like me to even learn the different parts of it, and to be able to go into it again and again and again and again. But this distinction that he's making here, Kanze, between sacred and profane, is really significant because we've, as you'll see from his next statement, we've lost a lot of that. So again, this would not have shocked anyone. The most reputable philosophers of both Europe and Asia up until about the year 1450. But about that time, there began in Europe that estrangement from reality, which is the starting point of most modern European philosophy. Estrangement from reality. Epistemology took the place of ontology, whereas ontology was concerned about the difference between reality and appearance, so the nature of reality. Epistemology concentrated on that, what the difference between valid and invalid knowledge. William of Ockham, the alchemist who set the tone for all later phases of modern philosophy, asserted that things by themselves have no relations to one another, and that a mind external and unrelated to them establishes all relations between them. Ontology as a rational discipline, that is the study of reality, as a rational discipline, then lost its object, and all questions concerning being as being seem to be merely verbal. Science should not concern itself with the things themselves, but with their signs and symbols, and its task is to give an account of appearances without bothering about existence in essence, or secondarily, essence of its hypothetical constructions. In consequence, thinkers seek for, quote, successful fictions, and reality has become a mere word. It is remarkable that 1400 years before that, the Mahayana Buddhists had taught almost exactly the same, when they realized their estrangement from reality, they looked for a reality more real than they found around them. That is, they looked for the Dharma element, the Dharma Dhatu itself. Modern philosophy concludes that it is better for us to turn our backs on nebulous ideas about reality as such and to concentrate on gaining power over the environment as it appears. But power by whom and for whom? Here, a philosophy which teaches that the particular alone exists and that universals are mere words finds refuge in an abstraction called man, or humanity, who is somehow regarded as the highest form of rational being, and for whose benefit all these developments are said to take place. To Nagarjuna and his followers, this by itself would seem to indicate a serious logical flaw at the very basis of such doctrines. Finally, and that is much easier to understand, the hierarchical structure of reality is duplicated by and reflected in a hierarchy among the persons who seek contact with it. Like is known by like, and only the spirit can know spiritual things. In an effort to commend Buddhism to the present age, some propagandists have overstressed its rationality and its kinship with modern science. They often quote the saying of the Buddha, who told the Kalamas that they should not accept anything on his authority alone, but examine and test it for themselves, and accept it only when they had themselves cognized, seen, and felt it. In this way, the Lord Buddha finds himself constricted as a supporter of the British philosophical tradition of empiricism. But who can do this testing? Some aspects of the doctrine are obviously verifiable only by people who have certain rather rare qualifications. To actually verify the teaching on rebirth by direct observation, one would have to actually remember one's own previous birth, an ability which presupposes the achievement of the fourth dhyana, state of trance, extremely scarce and rarefied. And what width and maturity of insight would be needed to actually know that the decisive factor in every event is a moral one, or that nirvana means the end of all suffering. The qualifications are moreover existential and not merely intellectual. Buddhism has much to say about the spiritual hierarchy of persons. For what someone can know and see depends on what he or she is. So the saint knows more than the ordinary person, and among the saints, each higher grade more than the lower. In consequence, the opinions and experiences of ordinary worldlings are of little account, on a level with the mutterings of house painters laying down the law about Leonardo da Vinci's Virgin of the Rocks. Kanzi is a curmudgeon. It's something I like about him. He's right. I don't know, Gumpo. No? Western writer. I can't remember. Oh, Gunther. Gunther. Yeah. Keen's Keen's remembering. We had one member here who was always lecturing me about I shouldn't be talking about Kanzi or Herbert Gunther because they're too side of intellectually involved, so to speak. She was saying it of just mere impatience and prejudice, not of any interior insight. So this is my passion. Yeah. So at any rate, this sense of sacred and profane, I think, is so critical because it really is true. I think especially the Americans, we take on something like Hatha Yoga and we just sort of ignore the people in India, like nothing to learn from them. With the Tibetans, um, suddenly the Tibetans are there. Well, we're going to do Buddhism better than them. We're just going to leave some of the stuff that we don't like behind instead of trying to understand what's the meaning of these different terms. And sure, there are some things that are like cultural in the sense that they're um, not critical. But we're so quick, Americans especially, to throw out the baby with the bathwater because of this kind of arrogance that we don't know nothing. We don't need to know nothing. We're good enough as those damn Europeans. I don't know where it comes from, but nonetheless, we cut ourselves off from valuable help. In the sense, especially of the sacred and the profane, it's basically a Protestant culture, and there's often like an opposition to a sense of the sacred as being superstitious, as being ignorant, as being harmful, of wanting to trick people or something, keep them in a state of not knowing. So we have all these kind of unconscious kind of prejudices. Uh, and so when you see the Dharma as being presented here in the Tibetan tradition of mental development, it was in the early 1800s that there was a movement called Rime in Tibetan Buddhism. And I can't remember what Rime means, but basically there were great lamas in the different particular traditions and lineages who came together to counterbalance a kind of sectarian tendency that had been building within Tibet. And the modern lamas, almost every lama that we've had contact with here is a Rime lama. They're all modern Tibetan Buddhism is all within this Rime tradition with very few exceptions. And one of the things they did is that's when they constructed the Nundro. They never had this Nundro teaching. This Nundro again means go before. So these were the formal structure of the preparatory practices in this graded step-by-step order that was entrance into the Vajrayana. Before that, it wasn't like that at all. You had the karma to receive an empowerment from a particular lama. They had all these teachings out there, but they hadn't kind of packaged it together. It was all, as people's experience unfolded, they came across the teachings they needed and the vastness of it. At any rate, I myself have found, the Nundro teachings, which I didn't come across until, how many years I've been practicing Western Buddhism, 20 years or something. And it's so valuable because it's this order. Now, they're not preliminary teachings really, because they're complete teachings. The practice of the Nundro can take one to Buddhahood, the lamas assert. And yet the order of it is very helpful because it talks about, the teachings that turn the mind towards the Dharma, and then the teachings that are the Dharma themselves in the development of our mind. And this order, I think, is just very, very helpful because, for instance, the four thoughts that turn the mind, it starts with the precious human birth. And when you really deeply contemplate the rarity of this existence, this human existence, and then the tremendous capability of it and potential of it, how it's better than an animal birth. And that's not to slander the animals at all. It's better than a heavenly birth. Certainly, we can't slander the superior qualities of the sensual deva realms. But nonetheless, you start to learn just how rare the human situation is and its tremendous potentiality. And this changes one's attitude. And then, of course, the second truth that turns the mind is impermanence. You realize, oh my goodness, I'm in this tremendous situation, but it's not going to last. It's limited in time. There's no time to waste. And then the suffering nature of it. So when you understand this third thought of the suffering nature of samsara, right away it makes you feel better. Because for most of us, the suffering, there's something that's so completely cruel about the experience of suffering, because you just feel like it just shouldn't happen. And when it does, it seems so completely unfair, especially sharp kind of suffering. And it just poisons the entire, all of reality. It just seems so completely wrong and so painful and just completely, yeah, cruel. But then finally, cause and effect. So something you can do about that. It changes one's attitude fundamentally, because even impermanence itself, when something goes wrong, someone scratches your car, the neighborhood juvenile delinquent keys your car. It no longer is it 100% suffering, because there's some understanding there. The understanding that this is the nature of things. Every car is going to end up as a pile of junk. And so this unstated kind of assumption that everything should be perfect, and then when it isn't, it's like this betrayal of reality. Oh my goodness. It's like, a young child coming across I don't know, someone, jealousy in school or something. You have a kid that's kind of pure, and then, kids are doing some sort of gossip about them. It's so painful. But with impermanence, and the deeper we go into that, and of course, all of these things are gateways into the Dharma itself. So it's a graded path, but at each step, if you go deeply into impermanence, you're going to discover emptiness. So it's like a multifaceted jewel. Every little facet is really complete. Every facet can take you to the heart of that jewel. And yet the understanding of all the different facets and their relationships, it's all just like the opposite of a negative spiral. It's a positive spiral. Everything, everything, everything. It's like this conceptual wall that we've put up between our experience of our own mind. It's like all the Dharma we do, all the concentration we do, all the attempts to understand that we do, all of this sincere activity, which is really virtuous, all the patience, all of it, every one is like a little laser boring into that imaginary wall. And so the wall's still there, but it gets thinner and thinner and thinner. More and more light is shining through, even through the little holes. And then the more holes there are, the more light. So it's totally positive, even on the path of being diluted. But we're no longer 100% diluted, and that's the difference. It's like, in Mammoth Cave in Kentucky, they take you down there and they turn off the electric lights. It's totally dark. You cannot see your hand right in front of your face. But one match, one candle changes the quality of that darkness. It's no longer dark with a capital D, capital D, capital A, RK. And yet mistakes are still made, of course. But this is the tremendous benefit of the Dharma, and that's why it's sacred. So how do they express that? Well, one, there are dharmas with a small d, means basically the appearances. All the concepts and qualities and existences revealed by science, for instance, in our ordinary dualistic mind. Those are called dharmas, but it includes psychological states, of greed or joy or anything. They're all called dharmas. So that's the stuff that we can work on with our thinking mind and our experiential mind. So dharmas. But then there are dharmas with a capital D. What are those? Those are the sacred dharmas. Why are they sacred? Because they can lead us to greater understanding, to greater acts of compassion, but based on wisdom, based on things that actually are, not some, idiot compassion done out of self-attachment or just sort of blind faith, but rather seeing things as they are. So this distinction between sacred and profane, when we then talk about the precious human body, is significant because it's not just I don't know what, sort of some sort of the self-love of a species, how beautiful my cat is, how beautiful my precious human body is. Something you'd read about in a magazine, I'm always loving this stuff. Some of what I see today, these headlines that come up randomly on the internet, it was something about uh, trying to get you to, appreciate your negative emotions or something. I'm just thinking, people are so lost, So the path, the path is sacred. And in acting that way, we are acknowledging and actually participating in our own recognition, no matter how dim or how strong, of our own true nature, the fundamental dignity and fundamental virtue. But again, not in a, a self-concerned kind of way at all. To me, somehow it just makes sense that, this unfolding of reality, the first experience would be, happiness and self-liberation. Makes perfect sense. And then how much greater to go beyond, to the liberation of all. I mean, even as a concept, it's daunting. But right away, you see in your own life that when your mind is if your awareness is more than just this momentary self-grasping attachment, everything's better. It can just be for a child or one other person. And it's interesting how society, how we recognize this as a good thing, even when we don't practice it. There's a natural kind of recognition. And yet with the Dharma, it becomes very kind of humbling because you see, how our ordinary mindset again and again and again is completely wrapped up in our self-grasping. But to see it is wisdom, because then it has lost its iron grasping kind of quality. It's when you don't see it that you're really in the grips of it. And then it can happen. You can see it, and yet you're still sort of in the grips of it, but not 100%. And these are, painful situations because people can get discouraged one thing or another. But of course, this is the real value of the teachings. And also, we live in such a fortunate time that there are people who are traditionally trained. You meet someone like Garma Pache, and it's it's beyond words. It's inspiring in such ordinary, down-to-earth kind of ways, and yet at the same time something ineffable and something completely human and something completely related, not distant, but very helpful because it gives one greater confidence and based on your own experience and not just trying to convince yourself of something. So it's like all the help is there. So the Nundro, starting with this precious human birth is so important. I think it was that there's a book out. I think it's called The Torch of Certainty. I can't remember, but it was a little introduction to the Nundro practice. And the interviewer, whoever put the book together, had teachings from different lamas, including, I think, Chogyam Trungpa was one of them, Dejung Rinpoche, the great Sakya that I mentioned, and was Kala Rinpoche in there too. I think there were 3 or 4 contemporary lamas um, talking on it. And one of them said, I can't remember which one it is, see how this graded nature, this graded presentation of the teachings, how helpful it is. Because if you're having difficulty with, say, the idea of suffering, that samsaric existence is dissatisfactory and suffering, well, you go back to the previous one. What is impermanence? And you delve more deeply into in your meditation with impermanence, thinking about impermanence. And if you're having trouble with impermanence, go back to the precious human body. So by stepping back, you kind of reinforce yourself, gaps in your experience, and then you can go forward again. And then when you get into the not just the four thoughts, but what does it lead to? The four thoughts that turn the mind naturally lead to refuge. And so you start to understand the protection of refuge and why refuge. It's completely natural. When you see the suffering nature and you want to get out of that, we do. We want refuge. We want protection. Then the purification of Vajrasattva, then the accumulation of merit of the mandala offerings. So the Nundro is really a remarkable thing. Again, these great lamas got together 200 years ago and, kind of put it together. So it's especially beneficial for us in our degenerate age, no doubt about it. But it's not a beginner practice, you might say. It's go before. It's introduction, a beginner to the Vajrayana, but the Vajrayana already assumes faith or even experience of emptiness and the rightness of the great teachings of vast loving kindness and compassion, objectless compassion. So that's where the Vajrayana starts. But in our modern age, good grief, so many teachings, so little time, so few people who qualified to teach. All of these things are real challenges, but yet there it is, this tremendous path laid out, this sacred path. Okay, maybe that's enough for tonight. Any questions from anyone? Then we'll pick up again next time on the precious human body.
Frank, I forget the name of the text that you're reading from. What's the name of the text?
I was reading from the Buddhist Thought in India, Edward Conze, Conze.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, he's a very interesting man. His father was a German diplomat and to London, I think. And Conze fled the Nazis, and he was something of a communist socialist type. And then who knows how, I never really got the story. He got interested in Sanskrit. And the next thing you know, he was studying Sanskrit and eventually translated the full corpus of the Perfection of Wisdom sutras. And then went on to be a university professor, but always ad hoc. He never wanted to take on the obligations of tenure, and committee meetings and all of that. So he was something of a curmudgeon, and he was at sometime at Berkeley, sometime at University of Seattle, and I think in Vancouver also. So he had contact with very interesting people there. I met one. I had a client who was a severely autistic boy who was accused of, a sexual assault, which sounds a lot worse than the actual facts of it were, but nonetheless, in Allegheny County. And if you're like me, I had no idea where Allegheny County was, even though I live in New York. It's in the south, yes, Olean, south eastern, southern, yes, southeastern corner of New York. Southwestern, thank you. In space, there's no directions, right? Southwestern corner. So I was down there, and there was a local gadfly there who was was a professor at the local Olean College, and he was Swedish, and he was kind of the modern Swedish European intellectual, and he was again a local gadfly, and he was there about one thing or another. He was trying to make an issue out of something that was happening in the case. So I had some contact with him, and in our conversation, it turns out that he had been at the University of Seattle when Kanze was there, and he didn't like Kanze at all. He said Kanze was always complaining because in his classroom they were on the approach uh, approach of the airport of the airliners. Yeah. So he was always complaining about the noise of these airplanes flying overhead. Yeah, he even says that in this book. He's talking about, how in previous times people were able to contemplate their mind without the interruption of lawnmowers, airplanes. So anyway, this guy didn't like Kanzi because he was the fellow I was talking with, who was kind of a modern atheist type, so I had fun with him a little bit. But yeah, Edward Kanze, Buddhist thought in India, which, except for the last chapter, doesn't even discuss the Tantra. So it's just an investigation of the Buddhist texts and the evolution of Buddhism, to the modern form, so to speak. I think, like, for instance, in India, after the Buddha passed away, within 100 years, I think there were like 17 different schools of thought going on. Only one of those survives today, the Theravada, and one of the Mahasangikas evolved into the Mahayana and all its different forms. So it's very interesting in that way too. But I like Kanzi because he never sort of misses out on the importance of the Dharma. He has many wonderful things to say. And again, he knows the modern world so well, having bounced around Europe and academia. Okay. All right. Yeah.
Frank,
Roberta, yeah.
just to ask, could you translate the whole phrase, Om Shvabhava Shuddha Sarva Dharma?
Svabhava Shuddho Hang.
Hum.
Yes.
Yes.
Let's see. I actually was looking at it just a couple of days ago in the notes in the big Mahabodha book. Let me see if I can find it right here, because I want to get it right for you.
Thank you.
Mhm. If I can't find it, I'll do an attempt for you. What I love about this book is it has so many footnotes. What's challenging right now is going through all the footnotes. Well, let me give it a try without finding it. Om Svabhava Shuddha, Sarvadharma Svabhava Shuddho Hang. And or maybe this is it. Yes, here it is. Om Svabhava Shuddha, Sarvadharma Svabhava Shuddho Hang. This is the notes according to Labsang Lalungpa. The no essence mantra means the sacred syllables that signify the emptiness of essence of all things. They are intimately linked to the tantric meditation on the ultimate nature of reality. So again, this is important to understand. When we do this mantra at the beginning of any of our sadhana practices, we're practicing on the ultimate nature of reality. This meditation begins by mentally dissolving duality into the total void, ultimate simplicity. The specific sacred syllables, the mantra read, let all things dissolve into the void, detached from any intrinsic essence. Om Svabhava Shuddha. Sarvadharma Svabhava Shuddho. Yeah. Let all things dissolve into the void, detached from any intrinsic essence. So again, the complete emptiness of everything, absolutely nothing to latch onto. Yeah, well, great deal could be gained by contemplating that. Well, yeah, I think so. I think that these are all the teachings of great emptiness for sure. But they do it in the Tantra specifically, so you know, because it avoids the mistaken idea that, form or formless. You can have a dualistic idea there too. So in the Tantra, we're using forms, but it's totally empty. And so we're learning that from the get-go, that out of this emptiness, at one with this emptiness, arises the seed syllable. And so again, we know immediately we're not in this realm of ordinary appearances. Yeah. Jamgon Kongtrul is one of the great lamas of the early 1900s. Yeah, yeah. He's often associated with like the head lama of Rime. I'm saying that wrong because non-sectarian. Yeah, there you go. Does that help, Roberta?
A lot. Thank
Okay.
you.
Okay. Yeah, it's a very, very pregnant and valuable mantra. Okay. We dedicate this evening to all motherly sentient beings. May we never forget the suffering of other beings. May we always be concerned when we always look into the nature of our mind to find a place beyond birth and death, and through that benefit others. Svaha. Okay. All right. Thank you all. Onward and upward.